So, something I may or may not have mentioned before is that for about the last 12 years, mentioned before on this channel, is that for about the last 12 years, I have been collecting print newspapers, um, overwhelmingly British national newspapers, but also newspapers from other countries when I've travelled. To date, this is from about the mid 2000s onwards, I have about 4,000, literally. Um, Roughly one every 2 days. Some days I get several, some days I get none. Usually, if there's a big event or a particularly prominent person has passed away and I want to read the registry of their life. What can I say? It's just something I started off because I felt it would be an interesting way of kind of preserving history. Of course, you can look at newspaper archives online, but to me, it's absolutely not the same thing. It's a bit like a book to me is binding and paper. I, to me, an ebook, although it has its advantages, and I can see why it developed, it's not a book in the conventional sense. Likewise, a newspaper to me is something that it's paper, it's print. Um, I actually studied journalism at university. I didn't graduate, but that was my background, and I've long been interested in it as an industry. At times, it drives me crazy. I feel really worked up by some of the things that some of the approaches that are taken within the industry and some of the so-called journalistic approaches that are used. And other times I see really good journalism and I think that's very well written. And I think journalism is a very powerful thing. The point is it's spreading knowledge. It's making people aware of history, of what's going on in society. It's it's like a running commentary of history. Basically, that's what journalism is. Now, in this country, we have a particularly long tradition with the print press. I think it's fair to say that Britain is a country where the print press has been particularly influential, much more so than, for example, France. Other countries that come to mind where the print press has been quite influential, or at least where print newspapers tend to sell quite well, is Japan, India. I would say to some extent the United States, although in the US, cable news is also very significant, possibly more so than the UK, proportionally speaking. Um, in the UK, I would argue the print press has traditionally been more influential than television news. Although I could be wrong about that, it's just my gut feeling. In the US, it's the other way around, where television news has been more influential than um, well-known newspapers. Um, so there's no question about it. Print newspapers have had the power in this country to bring down governments, and they have done so. There's been very many famous headlines over the years. Um, there is a lot of commentary about the differences between newspaper approaches, and we had something of a landmark moment 7 years ago with the phone hacking scandal, when basically enormous corruption was exposed in the Murdoch empire, when senior figures in the red top press were basically colluding with police officers to get information over sensitive cases, and all sorts of things were being revealed. Public figures were having their phones bugged, even private figures. And in one of the most despicable examples of that, murdered girl, a young girl who'd been actually murdered, her phone had been bugged by the tabloids um, in order to get a story with what was happening. There's a lot of other nuances to it, too much to go into here because it was an ongoing and pretty complex case. But basically, at its core, it exposed just how rotten the red top press can be. I don't think they have particularly changed since then in terms of standards. I don't believe they have many standards. So I won't lie, I'm pretty scathing about what I think of the red top press, but they have their uses. And I can see why they are generally far more successful than so-called quality newspapers. So in the UK, we have roughly these two kinds, like within national newspapers. I'm not talking about local newspapers, which tend to be a little bit more on the tabloid side of things. Actually, tabloid just refers to the literal size. That's a misconception that tabloid is the approach. Tabloid is literally just the size of the newspaper. So nowadays, the Guardian is actually tabloid format. That's the size. However, in the public mind, tabloid means sensationalistic, focused a lot on celebrities, focused a lot on gossip, whereas so-called quality newspapers tend to be focused more on hard-hitting news journalism. But to be honest, these are slight stereotypes because you can get serious journalism insofar as serious stories covered by the tabloid press. I mean, I've just looked at an article in the Daily Express which was talking about the issue of migrant workers being exploited by greedy employers who are paying them as little as £1 an hour. So that's a serious human rights issue. And that's in the Daily Express, not a newspaper I have much time for. So when I'm critical of the red top press, I also have to, I guess, be fair. Not every single thing they publish is a bad thing. One thing I dislike about the red top press, I do believe they're very arrogant. I think they often hide behind the concept of free press. To there's a lot of things that are problematic. For example, they will have a big, especially the Daily Mail, they will have a big judgmental headline on the front page. But if they get something wrong, legally they're obliged to apologise, but it will be in small letters on page 30. I believe that the apology should be the same level as the mistake. Um, Now, every newspaper will claim that they uphold journalistic standards, but the way that the Red Hot Press report things is extremely biased. Um, Now, some so-called quality newspapers are certainly very biased as well. The Guardian is very left-wing. I don't think anyone could rationally dispute that. Um, Probably my favourite newspaper is the London Times. The reason being, it's broadly centre-right, but not so um, bombastically right-wing as, for example, the Daily Mail. Now, the Daily Mail will claim that they're not biased because they're just as critical as of the Tory party as of Labour. There's some truth in that. They're almost skeptical of all parties. That's true, and that's a good thing. But the thing I dislike about the Daily Mail is they have these big booming headlines, and they love to play judge, jury, and executioner. But when the scrutiny turns on them, they automatically get on the defensive and, oh, you're attacking freedom of the press. So there's an incredible arrogance in the heart of the British print press, whereby senior editors basically think that they're above criticism. And I think that mentality needs to be challenged. I strongly believe that if we hold politicians to account, that is to say, every 4 years, politicians are put up for election. They're under constant scrutiny by the press. They have to appear on programs at question time. I would argue politicians face far more personal scrutiny than tabloid editors. And I don't think that's fair. I think tabloid editors should face just as much personal scrutiny as any government minister. Why? Because they have just as much power, if not arguably more. I mean, if you're an editor of a major national newspaper, your power is probably only surpassed by the Prime Minister. And even that's debatable. So I think that the likes of Paul Dacre represent everything that's wrong with the red top press. You know, to give him as an example, he's the owner, the editor of the Daily Mail. He never shows his face in public. Senior ministers, if they don't show up on question time, they would be absolutely criticised for that. So I do think there's double standards in how politicians are scrutinised versus how powerful journalists are scrutinised. In my opinion, they should both be. We talk about the need for press freedom in order to hold politicians to account, and that's good. That's a good thing. You need it in democracy. Otherwise we would have a situation where, like in China, where the press is entirely controlled by the ruling regime, and that's incredibly corrupt because then they can just, order the press to report things in a good light. Um, so it's very good that we don't have that situation, but I do also believe that in a way the print press has too much power here in the sense that I believe there is a certain lack of accountability there. Now, they will say, oh, but if we libel someone, we can be sued and people can choose whether or not to buy the newspaper. That's true. But I do think they very often hide behind the argument of press freedom, and I have a big problem with that. I think it's arrogant. Um, imagine if a politician turned around and said, "Oh, don't criticize me because I'm in a pressurizing job." Most politicians wouldn't do that because they would be accused of just whinging and, well, you stood for election, no one forced you to, and that's true. Likewise, tabloid editors um, can't keep using press freedom as an excuse every time they're criticized, and that's what I believe they do. And that sort of arrogance I've got a big problem with. But like I say, it would be unfair to say they're entirely a bad thing. There are certain things that, frankly, tabloids highlight that quality newspapers are too hesitant about. You get certain particularly heinous crimes, for example. Okay, the tabloids can be a bit sensationalist about it, but they might argue, well, we're only saying what the public are thinking. Whereas, take the Times, for example, I said it's broadly my favourite newspaper, but there is a slightly snobby aspect to some of the quality papers. They'll spend 5 pages talking about the arts and about some art preview in one of the London galleries, and that's all very well, but it doesn't really tap into what the vast majority of the public can relate to. Um, so for me, I don't think there is any newspaper that, I don't take any issue with. The Times is roughly my favorite, but that doesn't mean I'm uncritical of the Times. Um, you can name any British newspaper, and I would find a way to scrutinise it. I mean, the Guardian is extremely left wing, and it's constantly pumping out identity politics and political correctness, and a lot of things I deeply dislike. Um, the Daily Mail is very right wing, and that doesn't necessarily mean conservative, but they are very, very, very cynical. And I think that is not necessarily a good thing. We talk about people losing faith in politicians. To some extent, that's the fault of politicians. But in terms of the corruption index, Britain is pretty far down the scale. We're not a particularly corrupt country in terms of international rankings. That's just a fact. So I think cynicism about politics also comes about from the sort of language that the likes of the Daily Mail choose to use when they're constantly getting into ad hominem attacks against leaders. It's not just criticism of policy. They often do get into ad hominem attacks in a very, very personalized way. I have a big problem with that. So there's a lot of dynamics to look at. But one thing that I want to raise is that the whole dynamic of print journalism is likely going to change in the coming years. I predict that by about maybe the mid 2020s, let's give it 7 or 8 years, we're going to see a situation where the print press might even become extinct. Let's give it a bit longer, maybe mid 2030s. But what's happened in the last 10 years, and at first I thought this was a backlash from the phone hacking scandal, but this has affected every newspaper. You've seen a big reduction in sales. Now, I think what's happened is that print journalism is being surpassed by online journalism. And people nowadays get the news more from social media than what they read in The Guardian or The Sun. So newspapers have had to adapt to this. They have online versions, but a lot of them you have to pay for. And that isn't as flexible as just going into a shop and buying a newspaper. So I think that has changed the whole dynamic of journalism. Um, Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, has just said that Prime Ministers have a shelf life of a maximum of about 6 years because the 24-hour news cycle has totally changed the dynamics of what leaders have to deal with. And I think he's right. Um, he's predicted that we'll never again see 10-year Prime Ministers. Now, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe there should be a limit on how long PMs stay in power. But I think he's also tapping into the idea. I mean, Brown got a very rough time from the press. Um, I think he's also tapping into the idea that every single thing they say and do is scrutinized. And in a way, that's understandable because, the leader of a nation. But I do think that if you look at how politicians are put on a pedestal, there's a bit of hypocrisy from what the public demand. On one hand, we crucify politicians if they do anything wrong. Yet on the other hand, we say we want real people in office. So my thinking on that is, well, let's say for example they have an affair. Does that really hurt anyone else apart from the politician's family? I mean, if they're lying, if they commit perjury or something like that, that is an important matter because it's about trustworthiness. But expecting Stepford wives in politics is ridiculous. So I don't think a politician should have to resign over saying something controversial. Um, if it becomes a consistent problem, and if they're clearly abusing their position, that's a different matter. And I do think if they have polarized a large segment of society, maybe they should apologize if it's going against a party line. There's a lot of ways to look at it, but basically, there's going to be interesting things happening in the coming years, and that's why I don't regret, building up such a big collection. Like I say, I've got about 4,000 newspapers. Some of them I don't even like. Sometimes I'm reading through them and it works me up. I'm thinking, why did I buy this? But it's history. I'm preserving history because one day they'll be extinct. They'll be gone. Um, from practical point of view, I have to try and keep them away from sunlight. Put a tile over them. I try to put some of them in a box because an old newspaper will get worn. So I don't regret that at all. I find it very interesting. Um, and to avoid being accused of being a hypocrite by buying papers I don't even like I say, it's not a case that I dislike every single thing they publish. The Sun or the Mail could report about a thug knifing an old woman. I'm not going to disagree with that. But I might dislike the way they have a very judgmental headline about welfare claimants or migrants. The way they're doing it in a generalizing, inflammatory way is very irresponsible in my view. So basically, if the industry is being pressured to change, with that should come more accountability. They can't just whinge that, oh, we can't compete with social media. We can't. I mean, in the United States, what's happening is CNN, as an example, are saying we've had to put up with this onslaught of fake news and accusations of fake news, and it's not fair. I feel that since Trump phenomenon, CNN has taken a very, very self-pitying attitude. They've blamed everything on Trump. And whilst Trump is certainly being influential in the discussion, and certainly Trump has been extremely thin-skinned and hypocritical, and there's many areas where there's legitimate criticism of Trump to be made. But one thing about CNN is they've spent a lot of time in self-pity. I mean, I've seen their panels where they sit around and say how awful it is that Trump is criticizing us. Well, here's an idea. Instead of just counter-criticizing Trump, why don't you self-reflect and think, well, maybe we should be a bit more accountable. When we do make mistakes, we should apologize. Now, CNN will hardly ever do that, nor will Fox, to be fair. It works both ways, left and right. Um, but this is something that journalism and journalists in general need to accept. When they get it wrong, they need to say so. And people need to be aware there are still many good journalists out there. It's a difficult profession. It is not easy developing a story, getting the information, reporting fairly. Journalists face a lot of barriers. It is a difficult job, and I think that's something that needs to be remembered. And I do acknowledge that national newspaper editors are under enormous pressure. I get that, but I don't think that's a reason not to be accountable, and I don't think at the moment they are accountable enough. They will say that they are. They will say, oh, well, people have a choice whether to buy the newspapers or not. But why doesn't Paul Dacre face the public in the same way that senior government ministers have to? Politicians every 4 years have to canvass, they have to be up for re election. And okay, you can say some politicians are useless, but the point is we have the power to vote them out. I don't think that national newspaper editors face enough personal scrutiny. Newspapers get criticised, But where is the individual scrutiny of those very powerful individuals? Um, these people have the power to make and break reputations. They can completely demonize someone on their front page. It might be accurate information, but they have the power to do that. So, when the tables turn on them, it shouldn't be a case that they hide behind press freedom. So that's something I really do think we need to look at in this country because they are immensely powerful. Um, what else can I say? Yeah, I think the whole industry is going to change, and this doesn't mean that online news is better. I mean, goodness knows, yellow journalism in the past, to give a generic name for the red top press, has been absolutely despicable, possibly even worse in the past. I mean, in the 1930s, let's say between the 1880s and 1930s, when it was in its development stage, the way they behaved was utterly despicable. They would blatantly just tell lies. Um, Even today, they can't quite do that. They can exaggerate, they can distort, but they can't quite get away with making outright lies. In the past, they would. And because it was, the way they behaved was absolutely. In fact, there was a sketch in Downton Abbey where they showed this big newspaper magnate in the 1920s and the sort of incredibly powerful position they held, but also the power they had to destroy reputations. There's many, many examples of this. If you look at political scandals in the early 20th century, the politician in question, we often think that they could just buy the press and so on. Not necessarily true. In the beginning of the 20th century, the power that the press had was immense. And if a politician fell out with a newspaper tycoon, they were finished. To some extent, that's true today, but I would say they were even more powerful in the past. It's scary how much power they had. Even in sports, very often fights in the world of boxing in the early 20th century were newspaper decisions. It was incredibly corrupt. So, anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent. There's going to be big changes in the industry, and I just hope that with those changes comes more of a sense of accountability. And this is really involves everyone. If we buy newspapers, we need to have the critical thinking to think, well, this newspaper is taking a certain angle, it's biased in that way. So am I buying it because I agree with it? Am I buying it because I want to know the news? What is it? I think it's healthy to have a degree of skepticism about every newspaper, and I do. I have my preferences. Generally, what I buy, like I say, is the Times and the Eye. These are broadly centrist papers. The Eye is left wing, the Times is broadly right wing, but they're both broadly to the centre. The Guardian's very left wing, the Daily Mail very right wing, the Telegraph very right wing. So, final point, by the way, when conservatives, complain about left wing bias, I would point out in this country, roughly 60% of the press is right wing. When you weigh it up, on the left wing side, you have the Guardian, the Eye, the Independent, the Morning Star, the Daily Mirror. That's five. On the right wing side, you have the Spectator, the Daily Telegraph, the Times, the Daily Mail, the Sun, the Daily Express. Definitely the right wing side outweighs it. So, that's something to consider. I'll leave it there. By the way, I think that left wing, right wing pendulum is healthy. So we're not just bombarded with one side. But I do think editors need to accept that they are not above criticism. And I think where there are going to be changes in the industry, more accountability needs to come into that. I don't expect an editor to like go and appear on Question Time every week. That's not practically possible. But I do believe they should be under the same amount of personal scrutiny as politicians are. And right now, that is not the case. I mean, a lot of people probably don't even know who Paul Dacre is, yet he's one of the most powerful people in the country. That to me is not right. Let me know your thoughts.